Hello? I haven't recorded any commentary on current events for quite a while, mainly because there haven't really been any striking news stories worth discussing. I'm not going to talk now about the political scandal related to the new budget and the new taxes that the Ministry of Finance and, in general, the monetary authorities are planning to introduce next year. First and foremost, that's because this whole story has nothing to do with the economy. This is politics. This is a clash between liberal power groups and patriotic ones. Here, it's important to make one fundamental point. Liberal power groups don't actually set out to destroy the Russian economy. That's not their goal. Maybe their overlords in the West who have such a goal, especially in light of the special military operation and the problems facing the Euro-Atlantic elites, which I'll talk about a bit later. But the Russian elites, the liberal elites, don't have that goal. Their goal is to stay in power at any cost. And what they're fighting for is power itself. In other words, they have to do whatever it takes to make sure that a decision to increase Russia's independence in the world and the global economy is never made. That's exactly what they're doing. They're making such a decision impossible. You can argue all you want that this is sabotage, betrayal, and so on if they come to power. They absolutely won't consider this to be betrayal. We remember the 1990s and the ideological leaders of that time very well. I remember very clearly how the chairman of the State Property Committee and Deputy Prime Minister Koch, after he had already emigrated, explained that every little street in Manhattan was dear to him because that's where he felt happiness. There you have it. This is something we need to understand. They believe that just as they feel happiness in Manhattan, we should feel happiness in Manhattan too. If we don't feel it, then we're second-class people whose opinions aren't worth considering at all. This is a completely typical picture. Now, as for the problems themselves, we can all see how sharply tensions are rising, especially military ones. On the border between Russia and the West, we see how flying saucers, some drones, and other things are suddenly appearing out of nowhere. We shouldn't dismiss this as nonsense. If for no other reason than just a couple of days ago, a transport plane from the German army was fired upon, if I remember correctly, with a flare gun. What's to stop someone from shooting at, say, an American plane coming into land at a US base in Germany with the manpads, bringing it down, and then claiming that the manpads was Russian? There's no shortage of such devices in Western Europe. This is a pretty typical scenario. The question is, why? Until yesterday, I didn't have a simple answer to that question because it's not enough to just keep referring to. You can, of course, refer to Khazin's macroeconomic fund reviews, but let's not forget that. Even though they've been available since midsummer and even earlier, people generally don't like reading complicated texts, even though the reviews themselves aren't all that difficult. But just yesterday, Some information came out that answered all the questions. So, in the global ranking of financial centers by the number of initial public offerings, London took an honorable 20th place. What does this mean? It means that the main foundational center of the Euro-Atlantic region, since the Federal Reserve is increasingly coming under Trump's control, that is, under the control of the national elites of the United States, while Frankfurt, and accordingly, the ECB have always been secondary structures in relation to the dollar and therefore the Federal Reserve. So, the most important financial center of this entire group has, in fact, lost its significance. And that means there are fewer and fewer resources left. All that's left is, as they say, our last and decisive battle. Now, moving on. A war with Russia without the United States makes no sense and will end badly for the European Union. For this reason, the European Union is trying by any means necessary, come hell or high water, to drag Trump into this war. That is their main objective. That's exactly what they're working on. Just in the last few days, there have been various rumors that supposedly deep intelligence data will be provided to Ukraine, American data, and that they will supply crews. I don't even know if that's true or just another tall tale. The number of stories lately has grown so much that it's impossible to comment on them, because you have no idea where they come from or how they end. I mean, you try to figure it out. 2 weeks go by after some news breaks, and then for a whole week there's nothing at all, just silence. Well, it's kind of like, it's like when it suddenly turned out that the ruling party in Moldova lost the internal elections, and all the foreign news agencies just clammed up, as if Moldova didn't even exist. But as soon as information came in about fortified votes on EU territory, suddenly everyone started talking again. Oh, now the ruling parties in Moldova have won. Well, that's just how it is. It's a typical situation. I've said many times that democracy is just a set of tools that lets the ruling elite stay in power. That's why a change of ruling elites can happen through democratic means. It's always something unexpected. So, that's exactly the kind of situation we have with the news today. In other words, we can see quite clearly that the overwhelming majority of information is. I don't even know what to call it, because it's not just deliberately made up stories. It's also tales invented by all sorts of people from the liberal elite who are in a state of deep hysteria, since they can't help but see that everything is falling apart for them. And they're trying to come up with things, like in Kiev before 1918, purple rays, the approaching French army, and so on and so forth. In general, fairy tales are a good thing. But unfortunately, they don't work very well. That's pretty much the picture for today. In other words, the attempt to organize this kind of provocation and actually spark a war on European soil, they keep ramping up their activity. And here's the question: what are those who are orchestrating all this actually counting on? By the way, we haven't even factored in what's happening in the Middle East yet. There, too, the chances are pretty high that something could be stirred up. And the situation is actually very simple. The thing is, when you don't have resources, let me remind you, London's financial center is ranked 20th. Then the only option is to sharply expand your, so to speak, sphere of controlled markets. Yes, of course, these markets might be completely different from what they used to be, but still, if you have an extra 100 to 200 million people, that's always, as they say, a thread from everyone makes a shirt for the poor, meaning everyone chips in a little bit. London gets a rocket, or something else along those lines. And for this reason, London's key objective is to destabilize the situation as much as possible in order to push out potential competitors from those regions where they might have a stake, primarily Western Europe and the Middle East, the Arab world. That's why I believe that Israel's actions, in general, are extremely dangerous for Israel itself because it's ramping up tensions. And the fact is that it will be hit very hard, and it won't be by Arab countries. This, for now, remains behind the scenes. So, at any cost, it's necessary to start now, because the longer we wait, the less likely it is that we'll be able to get the United States involved, along with its trauma. Well, there are all sorts of rumors going around. People are already speculating. Could Vance, if he becomes president early, support the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, and so on, and so on. I won't venture to discuss these topics, since these are very complex internal processes within the American elite, but I can assure you that if the strengthening of the U.S. national elite continues, and especially if they take control of the Federal Reserve, then even if Vance expresses a desire to play along with the Euro-Atlantic elites, it won't lead to anything for them, for the Euro-Atlanticists, because basically the interests will be different. So what can be said is that the showdown has reached a critical point, and this will unfold over the next couple of months, definitely until New Year's, during which one of two things must happen. Either a war will start, or this Euro-Atlantic unity will begin to fall apart. That's the point the situation has reached. It's not out of the question, for example, that they could start falling apart in just 2 days after the war begins, or something like that. But this point of tension itself is clearly getting closer and closer. And for this reason, any discussions about internal economic issues or any other topics are gradually losing their meaning until we reach this point. Because if the liberal team wins, then what is good? What is bad? That's one option. If the patriotic side wins, then that's a completely different scenario. So accordingly, that's what we need to focus on. So I think by New Year's, the situation will be more or less clear. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Yes, and one last thing. I completely understand that this topic, it's very relevant, and there's a strong desire to discuss it, so I want to say right away. All of this can be discussed in the closed Telegram channel chat. For the most part, I won't be talking about this on public channels. Maybe just a few specific points. Once again, thank you. I appreciate your attention.